The morning sun hit the turquoise water of my backyard pool just like it did every day, but the peace was about to be shattered. My name is Mark, and I bought this house for one reason only. I wanted a sanctuary. I worked 60 hours a week as a structural engineer, and the only thing that kept me sane was the thought of coming home to my quiet, pristine backyard. For the first few months, it was heaven. Then came Brenda. Brenda was the president of our local homeowners association, and she didn't just walk, she marched. She had that short blonde haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager," and a voice that could cut through tempered steel. It started small. A polite request to let her nephew use the pool for an hour, because their club was closed. I wanted to be a good neighbor, so I said yes. That was my first mistake. 1 hour turned into 3. One nephew turned into 5 cousins and a neighbor. By the second week, they weren't even asking anymore. I would wake up on a Saturday morning to the sound of screaming children and the smell of cheap sunscreen wafting through my bedroom window. I would look out and see Brenda sitting in my premium lounge chair sipping a margarita she brought from her own house, acting like she owned the place. When I finally went out there to confront her, she didn't even look up from her magazine. She just told me that according to a vague community sharing clause in the HOA handbook, private amenities could be subject to shared neighborhood use during peak summer months. I knew she was lying. I had read that handbook front to back. There was no such clause. But Brenda had the board in her pocket, and she knew I hated conflict. She leaned back and told me to be a team player, Mark, or things might get difficult for my property value. That was the threat. She was holding my home over my head to get free access to my pool. Her family treated the place like a public park. They left trash everywhere. They tracked mud into the changing area. They even broke my expensive outdoor speakers and never offered a cent to fix them. I felt like a stranger in my own home. Every time I tried to lock the gate, Brenda would call the city claiming I was violating fire safety codes by blocking access points. It was a calculated psychological war, and I was losing. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how a person could be so entitled. I realized then that being nice was a currency Brenda didn't trade in. She only understood power and consequences. I needed a plan that wouldn't get me sued but would make her never want to set foot on my property again. I spent hours researching non-toxic chemicals and substances. I needed something visible, something dramatic, but ultimately harmless. That is when I found the specialized dye and the reaction powder used in high-end pool maintenance training. It was perfect. If the pH levels were intentionally skewed and then hit with a specific reacting agent, it wouldn't hurt their skin, but it would create a spectacle they would never forget. I watched from my kitchen window as Brenda led her entire extended family through my gate for the 10th day in a row. They had coolers and inflatable rafts and a sense of entitlement that reached the clouds. Brenda looked at my house and smirked. She thought I had given up. She thought I was broken. But as I held that bag of specialized powder in my hand, I knew the game was just beginning. The suspense was killing me as I waited for the perfect moment. I needed them all in the water. I needed the evidence to be undeniable. I waited until the sun was at its highest point and the water was filled with the entire Karen clan. Brenda was in the middle, floating on a giant swan raft, looking like the queen of a kingdom she stole. It was time to give her the bill for all those free pool days. I walked out onto the patio with the red bucket in my hand. The chatter died down for a split second as they saw me, but then Brenda laughed. She told me to bring her a cold water while I was up. I didn't say a word. I walked straight to the edge of the deep end. The kids were splashing and the men were laughing, and Brenda was at the center of it all. I looked her right in the eyes and I told her that I warned her about the chemical balance of the pool today. She rolled her eyes and told me to stop being a buzzkill. She said the water looked fine and that I was just trying to scare them away. I told her that some things are invisible until they are not. Then I tipped the bucket. The white powder hit the water like a cloud of smoke. For a second, nothing happened. Then the reaction started. I had pre-treated the pool with a concentrated pH indicator that reacts to high levels of organic contaminants and a specific harmless dye. The water around them began to hiss slightly as the powder dissolved. Suddenly, the crystal clear blue started to turn a deep, violent shade of crimson and neon pink right where they were sitting. It looked like a scene from a horror movie. The children started screaming because they thought it was blood. Brenda scrambled off her swan raft, falling into the darkening water with a loud splash. As she came up for air, the dye clung to her skin and her expensive blonde hair. The more they panicked and splashed, the more the dye spread, covering every single one of them. I stood there like a statue, watching the chaos unfold. One of the husbands started shouting that I was a psycho and that I was trying to poison them. I calmly held up the empty bag, which clearly labeled the contents as a non-toxic vegetable-based diagnostic dye. I shouted back that this was a standard test for high levels of bacteria and sweat in unmaintained water. I told them that the color only sticks to people who haven't showered before entering, and since they had been using my pool for free for weeks, they had clearly overloaded the filtration system. It was a lie, of course, but they didn't know that. All they saw was their skin turning bright red and the water looking like a biohazard zone. Brenda was hysterical. She was trying to rub the color off her arms, but it was designed to stay on for at least 48 hours. She looked like a giant beet. She screamed that she was going to call the police and sue me for everything I owned. I told her to go ahead. I told her the police would love to see the footage from my newly installed security cameras showing 20 people trespassing on private property and bypassing safety locks. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She looked around at her family, who were all stained and shivering with fear. The children were crying, and the men looked humiliated. The sanctuary I had lost was being reclaimed in the most colorful way possible. But I wasn't done yet. I told them they had exactly 60 seconds to get off my property before I called the health department to report a mass contamination event caused by their presence. They scrambled. It was a stampede of stained bodies and wet towels. Brenda tried to grab her cooler, but she slipped on the wet tile and landed right back in the pink soup. She looked up at me with pure hatred, and I just smiled. This was the first time in months I felt like the master of my own home. The silence that followed their departure was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. My backyard was a disaster area with pink puddles and abandoned flip-flops, but they were gone. However, I knew Brenda wouldn't go down without a fight. Within an hour, the local HOA Facebook group was exploding. Brenda had posted photos of her stained family, claiming I had attacked them with acid. She was calling for a neighborhood boycott and demanding my immediate eviction. I sat on my porch sipping a coffee and watching the notifications roll in. I didn't reply. I waited for the heat to reach a boiling point. That evening there was a knock at my door. It was the police along with Brenda and 2 other HOA board members. Brenda looked ridiculous. She had tried to scrub the dye off, but it had only smeared, making her look like she had a permanent sunburn across her entire face and neck. She pointed a finger at me and demanded the officer arrest me for assault. The officer looked at me, then looked at her, then back at me. I invited him in and showed him the MSDS safety sheets for the dye. I explained that it was a harmless food-grade tracer used to detect leaks and filtration issues. I then showed him the 3 formal letters I had sent to the HOA complaining about the trespassing, which Brenda had conveniently ignored. I showed him the footage of them breaking my speakers and leaving trash. The officer turned to Brenda and asked if she had permission to be on the property. She stammered, saying the HOA rules allowed it. I handed the officer the official handbook and asked him to find that rule. He spent 10 minutes flipping through it while Brenda turned an even darker shade of pink. When he couldn't find it, he looked at Brenda and told her that she was lucky I wasn't pressing charges for trespassing and destruction of property. He told her to go home and stay off my lawn. The look on her face was worth every cent I spent on the chemicals. But the war moved from the physical world to the legal one. 2 days later, I received a formal notice of a $5,000 fine from the HOA for property discoloration and violating community aesthetic standards. They thought they could bankrupt me into submission. They didn't realize that as an engineer, I keep meticulous records. I spent the next 3 days gathering every receipt, every video clip, and every witness statement from other neighbors who had been bullied by Brenda. It turned out I wasn't the only one. She had been using the HOA funds as her personal piggy bank for years. I found discrepancies in the landscaping contracts and the pool maintenance fees for the community center. Brenda was skimming off the top to pay for her family vacations. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. This was about bringing down a tyrant. I called for an emergency community meeting. I knew Brenda would try to block it, so I sent the notice to every single neighbor individually. I told them I had evidence of where their monthly dues were actually going. The night of the meeting, the community hall was packed. Brenda sat at the front looking smug, thinking she still had control. She started the meeting by trying to formally vote for my expulsion from the neighborhood. I stood up and pulled out my laptop. I connected my laptop to the projector, and the room went dark. I didn't start with the pool footage. I started with the spreadsheets. I showed the neighbors the inflated invoices Brenda had approved for a landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law. I showed the $5,000 missing from the pool fund while the community pool sat with broken heaters. The room began to murmur with anger. Brenda tried to shout me down, calling me a liar and a psycho, but the numbers didn't lie. Then I played the video. I played the high-definition footage of her family trashing my backyard. I played the clip of her telling me she would destroy my property value if I didn't let her use my pool. The final blow was a recording of her bragging to a neighbor that I was a pushover who was paying for her family's summer fun. The neighbors were livid. They weren't just mad about my pool, they were mad about their stolen money. One by one, people stood up and shared their own stories of how Brenda had fined them for trivial things while she broke every rule in the book. The board members who were once her friends backed away from her like she was radioactive. By the end of the hour, a motion was passed to remove Brenda as president, effective immediately. We also voted to conduct a full independent audit of the HOA accounts. Brenda sat there in the front row, her skin still faintly pink, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. She tried to storm out with her head held high, but she tripped over a chair and the room erupted in laughter. The fallout was swift. The audit revealed she had embezzled over $20,000. To avoid jail time, she had to pay it all back and sell her house to cover the legal fees and restitution. Within a month, there was a for sale sign in her yard. The family that bought her house was a quiet elderly couple who spent most of their time gardening. The day Brenda moved out, I was floating in my crystal clear pool. The water was blue, the sun was warm, and the gate was locked with a high-tech biometric scanner. As the moving truck pulled away, Brenda looked over the fence one last time. I raised a glass of lemonade to her and smiled. She had tried to take my sanctuary and ended up losing her own. Justice is a dish best served with a side of neon pink dye. Now when I come home from work, the only sound I hear is the wind in the trees and the gentle ripple of the water. I finally have my peace back, and it is worth more than any property value. The neighborhood is better, the HOA is honest, and I learned a valuable lesson. Never let anyone treat your kindness like a weakness. If they try to swim in your pool for free, make sure they are prepared to leave with a very permanent reminder of who actually owns the water.